50% through industry. Our team is pan-Canadian, so we have, and then one US person down south, but we have partners at Statistics Canada and Health Canada, University of Toronto, McGill, Dalhousie, University of New Brunswick, and then Oregon State. So background. Canada has a large immigration and foreign-born population. It's about almost 22% as of 2016. And despite of what you might hear in the media, we'll all go through vigorous background checks, including medical histories. And immigrants play a very important role in the economic and population growth. So it's very critical to, specifically to finding skilled workers in regions across Canada. And so there's three, so the figure on the left kind of shows the countries countries where most of the immigration happens. So a darker red, we have China, India, Pakistan, Iran, US, parts of Western Europe, Philippines. And the figure on the right shows the three different categories of immigration to Canada. So the blue line refers to economic immigrants. The red line are those sponsored by family, and the green line is sponsored are refugees. And you can see these over time from 1980 up to 2016. And then you see this uptick. So basically from 1996 onward, you start seeing this divergent pattern of prioritizing economic immigrants, and then this uptick later in the year, which was corresponded with refugees intake from Syria. So yeah, just a little bit further information on the background of immigration to Canada. So the economic immigrants, past years, can you see this one? Yeah. So later in these years, we start seeing what's called the provincial and territorial nominations. So these are sort of prioritization areas, trying to get immigrants to migrate into more rural areas or smaller towns in Canada, as you'll see in the next few slides, that typically a lot of new immigrants prefer the bigger cities. Those immigrants that are sponsored by families, predominantly are spouses or partners, followed by parents and grandparents. And then the refugee counts show the different countries by period. So there's when you start doing some literature background search into immigration in Canada, you start coming across a lot of a term called the healthy immigrant effect. And so what this means is that immigrants to Canada typically live longer than native-born or Canadian-born counterparts. This has been shown in a lot of research. It's fairly a robust finding. And a lot of it likely has to do with the fact of that selection process of immigrants coming into Canada. They are screened heavily. They have high social capital as well as high skills, high education levels, and these types of characteristics seem to translate well with having better health, at least initially, when they move to Canada. This seems to be a little bit stronger with mortality. So when you look just at mortality and immigration, that seems to be the strongest indicator. But when you start looking at other types of health indicators, such as self-assessed health or mental health or maternal health outcomes, that healthy immigrant effect starts becoming a little bit less clear. And that risk of transitioning to poor health depends quite a bit on age and gender and ethnicity, and then also socioeconomic status and geography. And so some researchers have looked into whether or not that's a behavior. So as immigrants live in Canada, do their behavior start shifting more towards more Canadian risk behaviors, such as potentially eating less healthy foods, smoking, drinking more, all the things we enjoy in Canada maybe. That doesn't necessarily seem to be a driver. It's not quite clear what that is. Nevertheless, that we do start seeing a convergence of health outcomes with the length of time in Canada. So this, and I had one more point on this. So there is what's called the salmon bias, and so what that means is that there's thought that as immigrants age and they get older, they will like to die. They want to die in their home country. So we might be in the data that we're looking at go and for their last 5 years or 10 years of life, they go back home to their home countries and live out their final years there. And the other part of it is too, the less successful immigrants potentially also move back home, so you start seeing the selection bias of those who remain in Canada. Some of the research doesn't seem to be a driving factor, but it does exist. So the rationale and the objective of this study, so we're interested in air pollution, and so we're really interested to see whether or not, what the impact of air pollution is, and how does that look like with respect to length of time in Canada. And so when we start looking at air pollution studies in Canada, we often typically are excluding immigrants, specifically recent immigrants, but sometimes all immigrants, because of all these factors that I've just been talking about. So the majority live in the largest cities. They typically live in city core areas, in the downtown cores, where there's a higher exposure to air pollution. And this is particularly true for areas of Toronto and Montreal. We also don't know what their previous background histories are, pollution exposure histories are. So there's this unknown factor of previous exposure. And then, of course, what I just said, they tend to live longer and have better health. So they tend to have this very strong confounding impact on air pollution effects, specifically in cities. So because they're excluded, we don't actually know what this segment of the population, what their impacts are with regards to air pollution. So the objective is to assess the impact of PM 2.5, so particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns, on the immigrant population in Canada over time, and looking at year of immigration, age at immigration in the region each region of immigration. So the data that we're using to look at this is called the CanCheck, Canadian Census Health Environment Cohort. There's 4 cohorts now. This data will be using the 2001 cohort. And it's driven from the long-form census, which is a 20% sample of Canadians. And then there's some exclusions. And what this cohort did was they did some income tax record linkage. And with that linkage, they had 80% success rate with linkage to tax records. And so this was done to follow people over time. So where they filed their tax was where they lived for that year. And then that way we can follow this population over time. In this case, it's 10 years of follow-up time, 2001 to 2011. And so there's 8% linkage with that, and then those were linked with the mortality database, and they had very high success rate on linkage with this. There's now a new linkage, so it's the CanCheck, what I call CanCheck 3.0, and so they've had this tax record linkage has been improved, and so this linkage now has a better success rate, and this seems to might change the cohort a little bit, as well as follow-up is to 2016, so there's 15 years of follow-up now. Talked about the data, the methods. So most of the studies or the results I present will be using Cox proportional hazard models. Looking at immigrant-only models, there's a sample size of around 680,000, and then when using the entire populations of 2.4 million people, and these are followed for 10 years. We have multiple mortality outcomes, but all the results here are looking at non-accidental, so all cause. And then these models have been stratified by 5-year age groups as well as by sex, and then we use a bunch of subject level risk factors and covariates, as well as a couple ecological covariates, so the Canadian Marginalization Index, which has 4 factors, residential instability, deprivation, age dependency, as well as an ethnic concentration group. And these are at the census tract level or census subdivision level. And then we also use a community size variable and an airshed size, so we're not to adjust for regional differences in Canada. And then the pollution variable that we're using uses a 3-year moving average, the 1-year lag. So the pollution that we're giving for one person that 1 year for a certain year is their exposure at the previous year of their previous year. And then we're taking the average of the 3 previous years of the sort of index year. And so, for example, if it's for 2001, it's the mean of 1998, 1999, and 2000, and then this starts moving upwards to 2003, starts shifting onwards with this moving window. And we've created other moving windows, an 8-year lag and 10-year lag, or moving averages. And so there's been sensitivity tests that look at that as well. I'll just go briefly over this because this is not my area of expertise. This is the Halifax, Dalhousie folks that are doing this. So basically what we do is using satellite imagery, and the AOD is aerosol optical depth, and then it uses a geochem model that uses ground-based monitoring to validate the model. Creates a model, and then it goes all the way back to 1998. And then there's been some backcasting. This project doesn't use any of the backcasting data. It goes back to 1981. But so we're using actual satellite imagery data. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is using this is a 10-kilometer grid cell, so it's a little bit pixelated. We've now are using a 1 kilometer grid. But this is kind of a little bit of what the exposure distribution looks across Canada. So of course you have these big red areas in the larger cities, and pretty much green and everywhere else. So the next bunch of slides are some descriptive stats of within and between some of the groups. And so what we have here is, so within groups with non-immigrants, and this is PM quintile across the top. And so what you see is for non-immigrants, you see that it's a fairly even distribution across PM quintile, but for immigrants, you see that the majority are in this higher PM category, greater exposure. And then when you look across groups, again, you see this disparity. There's quite a bit of disparity between the groups, between non-immigrants and immigrants. Looking at community size, again, fairly even distribution across these sort of different sizes of communities. So this is less than 10,000 people, all the way up to greater than 1.5 million population. So this category refers basically as Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. What you see is then within immigrants, you see a greater majority settling in these larger cities, and again, you still see that, and you see this immigration pattern. So what this basically shows is that immigrants tend to settle in cities, and they're exposed to higher levels of air pollution. When we look at the period of immigration, so what this is very recent immigrants are those who have immigrated less than 5 years prior to 2001. So this is people from 1996 up to 2001. Then we have the next group is for 6 to 10 years, and then a 10 to 20 years and greater than 20 years of immigrants. So these are those who have immigrated prior to 1980. And again, across levels, the quintiles of particulate matter. These are fairly, nothing too crazy. These actually are fairly even. When you look across the groups, you see these little bit of these differences. And so what this indicates is, probably the next slide will do that a little bit better, but those more established immigrants will tend to be moving out of the cities and moving into smaller communities. And so you see that with these next tables, especially here. And so you have these more established groups, immigrants living within the smaller cities. When you look at country of origin, so this variable is where they had citizenship prior to moving to Canada. So it might not be the best variable. We now are using a country of birth, and this might change a little bit. So again, what this shows is previously 20 years ago, majority of immigrants were coming from the U.S. and from Europe, and how that has changed over time. And then more recent immigrants, we're seeing more recent immigrants from Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, and East Asia and South Asia. So the next slides, set of slides are these. What these are the hazard ratios for all-cause mortality. So irrespective of air pollution, this is just the hazard ratios for the different immigration groups. And so this one is for previous region of previous citizenship. And this is comparing where non-immigrants are, these are hazard ratios for non-immigrants. So when you look at comparing across regions, no matter where the immigration group is coming from, you see that all immigrants tend to have a better hazard ratio than non-immigrants, and that is more pronounced in some of these countries, specifically East Asia, which is like mainly China, but also Japan, Korea's, Africa, and then South Asia. And then with age of immigration, again, you see that across all ages, you see this greater, higher hazard ratios for non-immigrants compared to all levels of, irregardless of age of immigration. And then looking at the period of immigration. And so those who have, so this variable has one more group, so this is greater than 30 years, so those who immigrated prior to 1970, still having a lower mortality rate than the non-immigrants. And then as you get to more recent immigrants, that hazard ratio increases. So part of the motivating factor for this study was to look at how do we then start adjusting for, how do we adjust for immigration? Should we, again, without excluding them, should we stratify by immigration period? Should we stratify or just add it as a covariate in the models? And so what this slide is showing is that on the very right, you see when you don't, so this is a hazard ratio. So these are hazard ratios for PM now, for 10 microgram per cubic meter increase. And so the figure on the right is when you don't do any adjustment, and then when you add adjustment, either stratify by year of immigration or period of immigration, what we saw, or just adjust as a covariate. You see these slight differences in your hazard ratio. So including or adjusting for immigrant status does have an impact on your overall outcome. And so this is sort of also a stratified. So this is stratified analysis. So it's kind of hard to look at all at once. So again, this is non-immigrants. So this is the hazard ratio of all just non-immigrants. So not including immigrants is what the hazard ratio for PM 2.5 might look like. And then among immigrants, here is the more established PM for air pollution, 11 by, and then as you go across, so here's a by period of immigration. So as you move across, you start seeing that the actual, this hazard ratio doesn't actually change too much, but the confidence intervals as we lose population does. And this most recent, the most recent group of immigration doesn't have there's no pollution impact with this most recent group. So what this is now looking at is an interaction between the PM model, so between PM and period of immigration. And so again, this is comparing the period of immigration with non-immigrants. So these hazard ratios are for the non-immigrant population, and comparisons between the various levels. So one being the more established, 2 being the sort of medium established group, 3 and 4 being the more recent and very recent groups. And so this panel looks at this low, so looking at levels where PM is at around 5 micrograms per cubic meter. You see this difference in your hazard ratios, a greater difference between comparing these more recent groups compared to the non-immigrant groups. And then when you look across PM levels, you see this, a slight change. The pattern is relatively the same, but then as you get into these higher pollution areas, you start seeing a greater change with this more recent, comparing the more recent group to non-immigrants. So there's something clearly distinctly different about these most recent immigrants especially with these ones who have immigrated within 5 years, but a little bit also within the first 10 years. This one is looking strictly at immigrants only. So again, lots to look at. So let's focus on the left-hand panel here. So again, this is the reference group is the most recent, less than 5 years. And so what this shows is this, among immigrants, you see a downward trend of PM, of your hazard ratios with exposure to PM 2.5, comparing the different groups, immigration period groups. And as you move across your PM value, these differences tend to increase. So just some conclusions. So immigrants tend to live longer than native-born Canadians, and this seems to be regardless of a period of immigration, your country of origin, and age of immigration. The recent and very recent immigrants seem to be distinct than the more established immigrants. And based on this, as well as other sort of criteria, what we'll be doing for the long-term analyses of air pollution, the length of time in Canada should match the length of exposure window. And so we have exposure lag periods going back 10 years. So our minimum length of time in Canada is going to be 10 years, a 10-year period. So going forward, we're going to be excluding all recent immigrants or recent immigrants less than 10 years because we want to have that exposure window included for their time in Canada. So some forthcoming analyses. I'm going to rerun these using this new CanCheck 3.0. It has 16 years of follow-up. So hopefully with these extra 5 years of follow-up, see if the results hold. Preliminary sort of checks between these two cohorts, between the CanCheck 3 and the 2. We're seeing slight differences between the impacts of immigrants on the hazard ratio of air pollution. And so whether or not that's just a follow-up thing or not, or whether it's a linkage, better linkage with the data, and so the population is slightly different. We want to test some of these different interactions. So looking within just specific cities, looking say just within Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, look at some of these interactions, cross-level interactions with neighborhood level or census tract level immigration densities, whether or not these might provide any kind of buffering impact on the health outcomes. And then possibly, if we can figure out a methodology to do it, track mobility and health across follow-up time. So can we look at immigrants and how they've moved from cities to maybe smaller cities as their pollution profile has changed, and does that impact their health, or is it the context of living where they're living change with their health outcomes, and specifically mortality. With that, there's some references at the end, but thank you. Big questions.
Thank you very much, Anders. So we do have time to ask questions. And
Yeah. Should talk slower. Right, yeah. Right, yeah. Well, so, and my title might be a little bit not super accurate either, because actually you're seeing that air pollution doesn't seem to me make much of a difference. What you're kind of seeing is that this healthy immigrant effect seems to be more prevalent, or seems to be stronger in higher pollution areas, and this could just be the fact of living in bigger cities, more protective effects. And so we're seeing, and this could be because there are, in larger cities, there's who knows, better choices to healthy foods, more community. I'm not quite sure. Yeah. In general, when you're looking across some of these other impacts of PM, what we're really seeing is that regardless of period of immigration, that immigrants tend to live longer and than the non-immigrant population, regardless of their exposure.
Okay, I'm going to put in a quick question.
Okay.
So I was curious about the country of origin analysis. And I know that to the time that everything that you've been working on, what are like the main highlights for the country of origin? And how did you actually distinguish people coming into immigrate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, tried to follow mostly what has been already done in other research, and for the most part, it's kind of on a continental basis. So it's people coming from Africa, people Central Asia, Middle East, and try to follow those follow those categorizations. It gets a little bit tricky when you start teasing apart those differences and what the purpose of that really is. So are you looking at cultural similarities between these regions or within like these groupings? And so that gets tricky when you look at, say, like North Africa. Are they more similar to Middle East, especially say like Egypt, versus are they more similar to south of Africa or middle and Central Africa, like culturally speaking? Is that and so if that's the reason why you're separating these regions of regions of where immigrants are coming from? What other research tends to show is that, and what this sort of confirms, is that people who are coming from countries that are culturally dissimilar to Canada tend to have this other protective effect, or seem to have lived longer than those immigrants coming from countries that are more similar to Canada. So looking at Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, these immigrants tend to not be living as long as people who are coming from China, Africa, Asia, or South Asia, etc. So is there something about this cultural dissimilarity that has some sort of impact on longevity in Canada? And it's hard to tease that apart with the period of immigration, because there's more and more, the more recent immigrants are coming from these other countries, of more culturally dissimilar countries, and less so from Western Europe and from US. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're not really, well, I mean, for the most part, like with using this data, we can't really judge on where the sources are coming from. For urban pollution, it's largely going to come from traffic-related air pollution and some industry. Rural areas, it's going to probably be wood smoke, driven by wood smoke and sort of residential heating, and some road impacts, and potentially so. But yeah, unfortunately, we're not able to do any specifically source appointment with this model or with this data. So there's some, I guess, if we're looking at the constituents of the PM, it's not going to be equal across or the same in geographically.
We have a question from the online audience.
Okay.
And I will have to ask you to repeat the question because the mic is very faint.
Okay.
So the question goes like this: smoking prevalence is much higher in Asia than Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And assuming that many immigrants continue to smoke upon residing in Canada, did your study account for smoking? Did it separate out smokers from non-smokers in the conclusion that immigrants tend to live longer?
So the question is around smoking and looking at the prevalence of smoking from immigrants, specifically from Asia, and whether or not, that they do continue smoking, and whether or not that has any impacts on the mortality. Short answer is no. We can't separate. We don't have that data. We don't have smoking data in the CanCheck. So there's no way to separate that out. What it appears, I mean, specifically when you start, again, looking at the longevity of those immigrants coming from China, which is driving that sort of category of East Asia group, they still tend to have be living longer than the rest of Canada, like native-born Canadians, as well as other immigrant groups. So it doesn't appear to be having an impact, at least not across all at a population level. And at least some of the work that we've been doing, looking at smoking and whether or not kind of adjusting for smoking indirectly, it doesn't seem to have that much of an impact on your hazard ratios when looking at a huge population level sample size like this.
I have a very broad question. Can you comment on the policy applications?
Okay, so the question was around policy applications of this specific topic. So as immigration is increasing, so more and more, this country is going to have more and more foreign-born Canadian people as Canadians and permanent residents, and understanding their health needs as they integrate and assimilate into Canadian society. How does that change over time, and what are those health needs that we're going to be looking at? And so that's part of the motivating factor, I guess, long-term, not necessarily of this research question, but other research that is looking specifically at immigration patterns. How does that change when immigrants live in bigger cities versus smaller cities? And then what really needs to get teased apart again is actual health, other health outcome measures. So looking at other types of chronic diseases, mental health, and maternal health, and how do these change, or how do these differ by different population subgroups, and between over time, like with different ages and sex. Matilda?
Thanks. Very interesting talk. This is a new topic for me. I didn't before we together about the health immigration effect.
You're gonna salmon.
Coming from Europe, it doesn't matter so much.
Yeah.
So I wonder, is this effect? Does it? I assume so, but I just don't know about it. Does it exist in other regions of the world? The health immigration effect?
Yeah. So the question's around: is this seen in other countries? And from what I've read, yes, in the U.S. it exists as well, and in Australia it does as well, to a lesser, but apparently to a lesser degree. So it's not quite as pronounced, it seems, as in Canada. Not quite, yeah. I haven't read much further into that, other than. It's a good question. Whether or not I guess if there's the hypothesis around cultural distinction and holding on to healthy cultural practices, is if that's the driver of this healthy immigrant effect, then potentially maybe living in Canada, immigrants are able to hold on to those patterns, those behaviors longer. The other thought is potentially a better integration into the healthcare system. So between sort of U.S., the issues there, and Australia. I'm not quite familiar with their healthcare system. I'm not sure if it's a two-tier system or not, but there might be maybe better health services available to recent immigrants and immigrants longer term. That could be another impact, and then potentially maybe just economic job prosperity in the country. But no, Mika. No, I'll just repeat it.
I have been intrigued lately from a work perspective about how much time immigrants have to communicate. That they are moving much longer than Canadian born residents in terms of where they're living and where they're doing work. And I don't know whether that's something you can track in the data at all in terms of how their exposures might differ because of very long commutes.
Right.
I came at this from an occupational perspective, but it occurs to me that data something to think about.
Yeah.
Second question, if you will, while you're repeating, when you're doing the additional analysis to get people who are moving, I think from a high to a low areas, you will actually be able to know if an individual is a transition, or they move from a high area to a low area, and a low area to a high area.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was around commuting, so diving a little bit deeper into commuting flows of immigrants, and so where they're settling, if they're settling outside of cities, or and where they're working, and whether or not that changes their exposure profile in certain regions. And then the second question was looking at mobility, not within cities on a day-to-day basis, but more longer-term mobility from cities to more smaller cities over time. And so the CAN check does have mobility, like of commuting flows data, I believe, and so that can be looked at. We're not going to be looking at that level of detail. But there is place of work address or postal code, and then residential postal code. So you could create categories based on distance of travel, and see if that has any impact on, one, mortality in general, but two, like, yeah, commuting time. Yeah. And then looking at, longer term moving, so we can see postal codes over time, so we can look at those who lived in Toronto at 2001, and then maybe look at those who if they've moved to a smaller or different city over time. And I'm interested in that question for the whole population, to compare these sort of groups. But one more, yeah, or I don't know.
We actually put that on my group that population within the city, really illustrated very strong. I had a question about, maybe I missed the political, but a lot of these people, if you think about just their evolution trajectory, people come from regions where evolution is 10 times higher.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking specifically at evolution and exposure, are you accounting for that, or is that by the region that they're coming from, and it's a wash, or? Yeah,
well, so like if we add region of immigration, then does that kind of adjust? Yeah, but I mean, exactly. And again, like immigrant, like say for Chinese immigrants, there are big differences between those that are commuting from, say, Hong Kong or Shanghai versus more rural. And like, I don't know those, like, I mean, I imagine most of our will be living in cities, or probably less rural Chinese coming from, and same with like, say, or like in India as well. So yeah, I guess it's a broad adjuster by looking at country of where they come out, as well as previous healthcare availability or other types of systems. So, but yeah, it's largely unknown, which is kind of why we let this kind of exclude them at the start, because of that sort of unknown previous history. Any other questions online? No?
Please join me in thanking Anders for his presentation today.